Hello and welcome, students. This is the part 2 video for my GDP series. There's just only 1 and 2 parts. The first part was just explaining what GDP is, what things do and don't count in it. The second part will be about a lot of the math components of the GDP unit and or section. If you hear noises while this video is recording, it's because my dog wants to play fetch and he's been very annoying about it, so I'll be chucking that bone around a little bit to give him some exercise because he's bored. So, what this video will include is the math components. So there's going to be a lot of formulas on your screen. When you see a formula, pause, write it down. I'd probably have a separate page in my notes just for formulas from this unit, if not just from this video. There are a lot of them. There's a formula sheet on my Moodle as well for my students, but frankly, just having the formula sheet won't save you because you can't use that on a test. AP exam doesn't have one. You just have to memorize them. So write them down in your journal to start the process of memorizing them. Otherwise, you will forget them. I forget them all the time. I have to go back and relearn them every year to make sure that I don't forget them because they are crazy important and there's a lot. So you just have to memorize them and sort of move on. The nice part is, on the AP exam, if there are 6 multiple choice questions, bark, what? Where is it? There are 6 multiple choice questions. I would wager Unit 2 is 1/6 of the exam, so probably maybe 8 questions will require you to do math from this unit. You can miss all of those and still get a 5. But if you get an FRQ with them in it, you have to be able to do it. Last year's students got really scared because they had a long FRQ, which was almost entirely math from this unit. And a lot of them didn't have their formulas memorized, so they just got rocked by it. So be very careful. Memorize these formulas, make it a big deal. All right. I grabbed the picture again. It's the second time I've done that. I literally never did that last year, and I've done it 3 times in these videos. Okay, let me grab it with everything. Nominal versus real GDP. So the first part, I'm going to need this epic pen first in the math we're going to do here. So nominal, let me actually just escape and then go full screen again. Okay, it still cuts off that. Interesting. Normally didn't do that. Whatever. Nominal versus real GDP. So this is a very classic distinction problem students tend to have is what is nominal GDP and what is real GDP. Nominal GDP is GDP using the current year's prices. So if you tell me that it's the nominal GDP of 2019, that is your GDP for 2019 using 2019's prices. That should sound like well, yeah, obviously wouldn't you do that? Yeah, you would, but the problem with that is that when you look backwards, things get kind of messy. Namely, when you look back like 60 years and you find that our GDP is in like the lower billions as opposed to 22 trillion. That makes it seem like our economy is doing so much better right now than it was back in like the 50s and 60s. But the thing to be aware of there is if GDP is listed by doing like the price of the final goods and services, prices go up over time. Inflation happens. A movie ticket back in the 20s was a dime. A movie ticket now is not a dime. So that can mess with your GDP. So nominal GDP is good for standalone because it's just current prices. Real GDP holds prices constant. That means is that it allows us to actually compare them. It adjusts for inflation. So let's see why that can matter. So, the most popular movies of all time. The highest grossing movies of all time. This is as of 2019. I grabbed this data at the end of last year. The end of last year / beginning of this year. Haven't really tracked it this year, but again, movies haven't really been a thing for like 4 months. So I feel like this is just perfectly fine. So the highest grossing movie of all time is The Force Awakens. That has been replayed in theaters multiple times since its release, so that's allowed it to go back up. Endgame is second. Avatar, this is not The Last Airbender, this is the blue space people one that is just literally Pocahontas, but sci-fi. Black Panther is 4. That one might be moving up because of the re-airings since Chadwick Boseman's passing. Infinity War, Titanic, Jurassic World, Avengers, the first one, Last Jedi, Incredibles 2. There's a kids movie. So, this tells you the most popular movies of all time. But does it really? And this is the nominal versus GDP question. These are all nominal grosses. This is all using the prices of the tickets at the time of them being sold. What is the highest grossing movie of all time? That makes common sense. Like, you're like, yeah, that's how I would check it. I would just take the price of the ticket times the quantity. Cool, but if you look at the years for a lot of these, and I'll move my camera the way so you can see it, outside of Titanic, these are all within the last decade. And Avatar, but that 2009, whatever. Okay, outside of the Titanic, those are all within the past decade or so. And I wouldn't say that movie watching has like peaked in the last 20 years, in 10 years. In fact, I'd say movie watching has probably gone down due to things like Netflix and all these streaming services that have a lot of movies. I don't go to the theater as much in the last 2 years that I did when I was like a little kid. So I would say that, yeah, I probably go to the movies less often. And that's true for a lot of people, I bet. In fact, that's actually statistically true. Less people see movies now. But then why are all these recent movies super high up? Yeah, get the bone. Did you lose it? He lost it. I have to go get that for him at some point. What I want you to think of is, okay, if we adjust for inflation, if we lock in the price, if I say that every movie ticket of all time is now being listed at $5, so what I'm really tracking is the quantity, right? What I'm really tracking is what was the most seen movie of all time, which one had the most ticket sales, as opposed to dollar value of the sale. No, I mean literally the number of tickets, because that would tell me what the most popular movie of all time is the one that was seen the most. Which one is number one? Think about it. Answer that question. I have to go get my dog's bone real quick. Where did it go? Where did you put it? I bet you lost it. Bring it to the couch somewhere. Where did you put it, Arch? You're the one who lost it. You want this other bone? This more? Where's your other bone? Oh my god. Ignore me in the background. There it is. Found it. Come on. Apologies if you got to see me crawling on the ground to find a bone that had gone underneath the couch. There we go. Okay, highest grossing movie of all time is not any of those. It's Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind in the year that it was sold, well, not the year that it was on, because it could have kept being in theaters for a while, made $198 million. This is back in the late 1930s, early 1940s. That is insane, because again, movie tickets back then were like 15 cents a ticket. And movie tickets at the time of like The Force Awakens were like $10 to $12 a ticket. So they would have to have sold, oh my god, like 100 tickets for every one that the Force Awakens made just to make the same amount of money. So what they do is that they've adjusted for inflation. They keep the price of the tickets the same, and they just multiply that price by the quantity. And the price they used was present-day prices. Okay, they used present-day prices. What they found was Gone with the Wind's adjusted gross was $1.7 billion, which again, if you look back at the last slide, we're not even at the $1 billion mark for these. But $1.7 billion is what Gone with the Wind has adjusted for inflation. Star Wars, the original one, this is technically episode 4, but it wasn't called that at the time because that'd be super confusing. A New Hope, $1.5 billion. Sound of Music, $1.2 billion. E.T., $1.2. Titanic, hey, that's one from the previous slide, is actually here. Because, again, 97 was the oldest any of those movies had been, and look at how much more it makes now. The Ten Commandments, yes, that was a movie. In 56, that is 1.1. Jaws, 1.1. Dr. Zhivago, which is a horror movie that none of you have heard of, is 1.073. The Exorcist, which is actually a real horror movie and is R-rated, is almost higher than every other movie on the previous list. The highest on the previous list, that wasn't Titanic, because Titanic was actually old, by comparison. The Force Awakens, the highest grossing movie of all time, is 11th, actually. Avatar is 15th. So that's why real versus nominal matters. Nominal is great to know how well a thing did in that year, especially if you're familiar with how the prices were in that year. Real helps you when you're comparing. When you're comparing year to year, especially across long periods of time. If it's 2 or 3 years, it's not the biggest deal. But if you're trying to compare things from 20, 30, 80 years ago, you need to be using real numbers. R-E-A-L is a vocab term. It means adjusted for inflation. If you see the phrase real income, that means income adjusted for inflation, because People got paid a lot less back in the day. That's not because they were getting paid less in value. They were just getting paid less in number because everything was cheaper back then, including their labor. Prices have gone up consistently over time. Okay. And it says the average income in the 80s was $22,000, and the average income now is $49,000. That doesn't mean people now are more than 2 times richer than people in the 80s. No, home ownership was higher in the 80s than it is right now. It just means that that just means that $22,000 got you a different amount of stuff back then than $22,000 will get you now. So this illustrates one of the big problems with using GDP. Because you can see something like this. From year 1 to year 2, their GDP goes from 4 billion to 5 billion. Is that country's economy growing? Based on the definition of GDP, it sure does look like it. It looks like it grew by 25%. That's awesome. Did it definitely produce 25% more products? Remember, it's the final dollar value of all goods and services produced, so the price matters. When you're finding GDP, you're really just taking the price of the final goods, multiplying it by the quantity of them sold, and adding that up for everything in our economy. Well, what if the price just went up by 25%? Wouldn't that also work? And that's the problem. So inflation is one of the big problems, with specifically nominal GDP. Nominal just means normal, regular old GDP. Inflation is an increase in price level being the price of everything in your economy. So if inflation is happening, it means the prices are going up. If prices went up by 25%, your GDP would increase by 25% on just the strict definition of what GDP is. Is that good for your country? No! Everything getting 25% more expensive is a bad thing. That is scary. In 1 year? No, that's not good. That is not a good thing. I don't make that much money. I can't afford things to get 25% more expensive. So, real simple math example. If this country only produces apples, and year 1 they produce 10 apples and sell them for $1 a piece, that's the only thing they make in that country, then their GDP is just $10. If the next year they produce $10 apples, and they sell them for $1.25, their GDP is $12.50. Is this country better off? No! This country is having a terrible time right now. They made 10 apples still. They are just as productive as before, and GDP is supposed to tell us how productive a country is. But based on the fact that it tracks it using dollar value and actual prices, it means that when the price is off, or when the price changes, it's going to mess with your GDP. And it can mislead you. And that's the tricky part. You've got to be really conscious. So, how do we fix that? How do we correct for that? We use real GDP. So if you're looking for definitions for nominal and real, because you don't have those yet, here you go. Nominal is measured in current prices. It doesn't account for inflation from year to year. Real GDP is expressed in constant, unchanging dollars. What that means is, if they're saying, okay, we're doing the real GDP for 2012, but we're going to use 2019 prices for that. The reason why you would do that is that way when I look at 2019's GDP and I look at 2012's real GDP, they're using the same prices. So they're using the same reference point. So then I can actually tell, oh, are we actually producing more than we were in 2012? If my real GDP goes up, then yes, I am, because it means that the actual amount of things produced went up, because the prices were sort of taken out as a variable. By holding the price constant, I am removing that as a variable that'll mess with my numbers. So real GDP adjusts for inflation, making it the best measure of economic growth, because we as a country on a typical year, COVID's going to mess with this, but on a typical year, we would experience around 2% to 3% inflation. That is sort of like our normal batting range of inflation, meaning prices go up by 2 to 3% per year. That should be kind of alarming, at least in the respect that, okay, then what does it mean over the course of 10 years? Right? And then how old are you guys as students? 18? Do some math there. Prices have changed quite a bit since you were a baby. So making it adjust for inflation allows us to keep things really in reference and keep things in mind. And that way it can check us for actual economic growth. What's our real GDP year to year? This will happen, it's a presidential candidate, it's an election year. If a presidential candidate says, hey, GDP has grown by 12% in the last 4 years. I think it's grown by more than that, but it's grown by 12% in the last 4 years. What you tell them is, okay, is that nominal or real GDP, sir? Because if you're saying nominal went up by 12%, we could have said prices go up by 12%. That is not a good thing. If they don't say nominal or real, they are almost always referring to nominal. If they don't say if it's nominal or real, they're saying that it's nominal. Okay, because nominal GDP goes up by a lot all the time because prices go up all the time. So congratulations, things are actually worse. But if they say real GDP has gone up by 15% in the last 4 years, okay, we are actually producing a lot more then. That sounds pretty good. That's actually a good sign. So be careful with things like that. You can get easily misled if you aren't paying attention to it. Okay, so here is one of the first big math things. I'm going to move my camera sort of out of the way a little bit so you can have as much view of this as possible. I think if I move it up in the top right, I should be fine, actually. Not sure, though. I'll make it a little smaller. Okay. So we've got 2008. This country makes 10 cars, 10 trucks, 15K a car, 20K a truck. So their nominal GDP, just multiply and add it all up, is 35,000. Okay, your most basic method for GDP, and frankly I should highlight this, but your most basic GDP formula is price times quantity. It's the total dollar value of all final goods produced. Okay, well these are all the final goods produced. What's the total dollar value of all of them being produced? Price times quantity, add it all up. So it's P times Q, but be aware you do 10 times 15,000, 10 times 20,000, and then you add them all up. Cool? That's your most basic GDP method. That's to find nominal GDP. It's just do price times quantity. In 2009, same country, still sells 10 cars and 10 trucks, but the price has changed. Their nominal GDP is now 370,000, right? Because the way we find GDP is just really price times quantity. When prices go up, the nominal GDP goes up. But based on what we've already talked about, is this country better off? Probably not. Because all that happened here was that the prices went up. Well, can I prove that it's not as good? Yeah, we can. The nominal GDP suggests that the economy is improving, but it's really not. How much is their real GDP? What is their GDP really? And how do I find it? What I do is I use the base year's prices. I'm going to use 2008's prices and 2009's quantities. That looks like I just did 2008's again. That's because 2009 had the same quantities as 2008. The way you find real GDP, listen carefully, write it down. The way you find real GDP when you're given prices and quantities is you take the base year's price, multiply by the current year quantity. So if I'm trying to find 2009's real GDP, I use 2008, that's the base year's prices, that's the 15 and the 20K, and I multiply that by the current year quantity, 10 and 10. If this said 12 and 13, it'd be 12 and 13 times 15,000 times 20,000, okay? My real GDP is 350,000, which is the same as 2008's nominal GDP. Why? What does that mean? It means they didn't actually produce any more. Which you can tell, I mean, you could tell that by looking at it, but if we look at a real country like the United States, and where there's more than just two goods being produced, and we find that our real GDP from 2017 and our real GDP of 2018 are basically the same, that means our economy didn't grow. And remember, there's 3 big goals for your economy each year. Maintain growth, limit unemployment, limit inflation. Great. If we find that our real GDP didn't really change very much, guess what? Our economy didn't grow. It stagnated, which is usually pretty bad on account of populations going up all the time. We have more and more people in our country every single year. So if our GDP stays the same, the average amount of money per person is lower. Bark, bark, bark. He's so angry that I won't throw it, even though he won't give it to me yet. Doing the classic dog thing of wanting to play fetch but not wanting to give up the thing that he has. He's very smart. Love that dog. What an idiot. Okay. Now, this is going to look super confusing. I acquiesce to that immediately. This is the formula over here. It'll be on the next slide as well. Another way to find real GDP, usually if they give you, stop yelling at me, Archer, usually if they give you a little more realistic numbers, namely if they give you like real country numbers, is they'll use something called the GDP Deflator. The GDP Deflator is what's called a price index. A price index is an average. It's a weighted average of the prices of goods and services relative to their prices in base years. That's super complicated. It's not going to make sense until I show you it with math, but you can pause and write this down for now. This part, CPI, is something we'll learn later this unit, so we'll come back to this slide at another time later this unit to sort of explain what the difference between these two things are. But the GDP deflator is found effectively by using a ratio. of nominal over my real GDP times 100. That 100 referencing a percentage. What it's going to tell me is a simplified way of seeing how much inflation happened year to year, and I'll show you. Oh, also there's a video that will help explain it too. If what I explained doesn't help you here, find the Khan Academy video over it. The guy is better at math than me. He'll be able to explain this pretty well too. I'll skip it.
The last video we
skipping it. Thank you. So, and here's your conversion stuff. You can find real GDP by doing nominal divided by deflator. That's why it's another way to find real GDP. But how it works is, I'm going to use the second example to show you what the GDP deflator does, is if the nominal GDP is 4,000 and the real GDP is 5,000, what was the deflator? Okay, nominal over real times 100, 4/5 is 0.8. That means my real GDP is 80. The real GDP is a index number, so things like if my nominal and real are the same, that makes my GDP deflator 100. Right? If nominal and real line up to be the same number, then it's 100. It means that everything is perfect. It means your nominal and real are the exact same. It usually means that you're in the base year, right? If I'm using 1 year's prices as a comparison point, then when I compare that country to that year to itself, you should find that it's the same. 100 means no change. If I find the deflator is instead 105, what that means is that prices have gone up by 5%. If I find that it's 110, it means prices have gone up by 10%. If I find that it's 80, it means prices have gone down by 20%. Which should make sense, because if the nominal GDP is 4,000 and the real GDP is 5,000, well, what's 80% of 5,000? 4,000. Okay, it means that prices have gone down by 20% in this year. So real GDP is a GDP deflator is another way to find it. Don't worry about this logically until we start doing math with it. If you're like, okay. Just take two things down in terms of understanding it. If your GDP deflator is 100, you're in the base year. It means you're comparing it to yourself. It means, hey, what's the GDP deflator in 2008? If 2008 is the base year, 100. If your GDP deflator is a little bit higher than that, it will be that percentage change more of inflation. So like if I told you, hey, using 2016's prices, the GDP deflator in 2020 is 111. That means that since 2016, we've had 11% inflation. That's the logic of it. If I say using 2012's prices, the GDP deflator for 2020 is 130. That means that since 2012, we've had 30% inflation. All right, the further back you go, the more inflation you should see, the bigger the deflator will end up being. Now, another thing you should be aware of, this is a formula. However, this is one you should be aware of in other math classes at this point in your high school career, is percentage change. So if they ask you a question like, what is the growth rate of GDP? They're just asking, hey, from year 1 to year 2, how much GDP go up by as a percentage? Where's the bone? Where's the bone go? Where is it? They're just asking how much did it go up by. If they're ever asking that question, you just plug into a percent change formula. If you're not familiar with what that is, it is find the value of the thing in year 2 minus the year 1 over year 1 times 100. It's the year later minus year earlier over year earlier times 100. It should be mentioned, because this does happen, people who have not seen this formula before. When I say year 2 minus year 1 over year 1 times 100, I do not mean in this problem here that you plug in 2008 minus 2007. You take the value of the thing you're looking for in year 2 minus year 1 over year 1 times 100. So it would be 5,000 minus 4,000 over 4,000 times 100, which means it ends up being 5,000 minus 4,000 is 1,000. 1,000 over 4,000, drop all those zeros, is a fourth. How much did it go up by? Was 25%. GDP went up by 25%. You might not have to plug that into a formula. If you have good math brain, that's the kind of thing where like, oh yeah, it went up by 1,000, it went up by 25%. Right. If it went from 2,000 to 2,100, what's the percent change? Okay, 2100 minus 2000 is 100 over 2000. That's 1/20th. Whoa, that's 5%. Think how many, oh wow, that's weirdly thick there. How many nickels are in a dollar? 20, so 5%. Bart. He's doing great. If they ask you to find the percent change of real GDP, you just plug in real GDP of year 2 minus real GDP of year 1 over real GDP of year 1 times 100. Can you stop barking at me? So that's the real GDP one. There is a second formula. I call it the cheat formula, aka the best formula. It's the awesome formula. It's the formula that saves you a friggin' ton of time on questions like this. That's what I highlighted on this slide. If they give you the variables, you can do this instead. The variables are nominal GDP growth rate, inflation rate. If they give you those two things, you can just do nominal GDP growth rate minus inflation rate, finds you the real GDP growth rate. Remember, real GDP corrects for inflation, takes inflation out of the equation. Cool, how do you take something out? Subtract it. So what you do is take how much nominal GDP grew by. So say that in this practice question, nominal GDP went up by 4% last year, and the country experienced 1.5% inflation. How much did real GDP go up by? 2.5%, right? If nominal GDP went up by 4% and there's 1.5% inflation, and real GDP corrects for that inflation, great. Then really our GDP only went up by 2.5%. That's the idea. That is the logic. Now, it has to be rate. They all have to be rate. You can't just do like, my nominal GDP was 500,000, my real GDP was 300,000, my inflation rate was 1.5%, so I can just subtract 1.5 from 300,000. No, you cannot just do that. Okay? It has to be percentages. If they're all percentages, then you can just do this. That's totally fine. This is also used for any nominal and real rate. So if it says the nominal income grew by 4% and there was 1.5% inflation, how much did real income go up by? Same thing. The word GDP here doesn't actually matter. If there's anything in the place of GDP here, namely interest rate or income, you can use that too. That'll still work. If it's ever a nominal and real rate problem, you can just do nominal rate minus inflation rate gets you the real rate. Now, break from the formulas for a second. Archer, stop barking at me. Quick small tangent from formula time. Does GDP tell us how well each person is doing? No, it does not. I mentioned that on the previous video where we looked at the top 10 economies in the world by GDP. China was 2, Brazil was 8, India was 7. Brazil was 9, sorry. Those countries, I would say, have pretty bad average life for their people in terms of how safe it is to live there, in terms of how well off they are economically, like how much money they each have. All those countries have it not super great. Very high poverty levels, stuff like that. So standard of living, which is our general measure for like quality of daily life for a person, it's measured partially by how the economy is doing, but a big thing that it needs to do is correct for population. It needs to correct for population. That is called real GDP per capita. Per capita is a thing you've probably heard in metrics before. It means per person. If no one's ever mentioned that to you, they're just being purposely confusing. Per capita just means per person. All you do is take the real GDP and divide by the population. It tells you how much on average do people contribute to the economy. And since GDP could also be measured by doing income, it can also tell you sort of close to, on average, how much each person is making. It's not perfect, but it gives you a much better idea than just looking at real GDP. When you do that, it changes the leaderboard a lot. Okay, when you do that, it changes the leaderboard a lot. The number one country in real GDP per capita is Luxembourg. Not anywhere close to the top 20 GDPs in the world. But they have a very small population and are fairly productive for that population. So the real GDP per capita is like $90,000 US, and the real GDP per capita of America is like $50,000, which matches pretty close to our average income, which means that theirs also matches pretty close to their income. So the average person in Luxembourg makes like 90 grand a year. I would be very cool with that amount of money. They have higher taxes there. They have a bunch of other stuff that goes on. Okay, the Nordic countries are also very high on that list. The only country that is high on the list that is probably a bad, like, isn't a perfect measure is Qatar, aka pronounced Qatar, Qatar. That country is very high on real GDP per capita, lots of oil, small population size. It's not awesome to live there for a lot of people. There's still quite a bit of poverty. It's just there are people there that have an insane amount of money that really tips the scales. But it is, out of all the measures we have, our best measure of standard of living. It's not perfect. Again, Qatar being number one and number two, depending on the metric you look at. They're not amazing to live at for every single person. I've been to Qatar. It is not terrible for a number of people, but it isn't amazing. Some other real per capita things you could see is real income. That's just income adjusted for inflation. That's better. Productivity tends to influence that. If you're more productive as a country, you make more money. That tracks. Real interest rate is an interest rate adjusted for inflation. Interest rates are things that, like, it's the price of a loan or the return on investment. So, like, if you have your money in a savings account, there will be an interest rate that sort of gives you money in addition to the amount that you put in there. If you take out a loan, you pay back the loan plus an interest amount based on the interest rate. Just like nominal, just like anything that's nominal, there's also a real version of that because your rate will change year to year. From a practical standpoint, not actually, but from a practical standpoint when you're paying it. So if you see that the nominal interest rate was 5% and there was 2% inflation, then really the interest rate you're paying was 3%. If you see, again, if there's any nominal or real rate thing, we'll come back to that. Don't worry about interest rates too much for now. We'll cover that a lot in the next couple of units. Unit 2 isn't big on interest rate. Yes, Archer. I think we're almost done. Why do some countries have higher GDPs than others? The number one reason for why your GDP would be different than another country is productivity, but there are a bunch of things that can lead into that. You don't have to write all of these down, but these are things to keep in mind, like real world, as to why might a country be more productive than another. One is economic system, and generally speaking, capitalist countries have historically had more economic growth. China is kind of the counterexample to that, but out of every communist country that has ever existed, China has the most capitalist components. They have literally free trade zones where you can engage in what is effectively capitalist practices. They have billionaires, which shouldn't really be possible under pure communism. So on the scale of communism, they are the most capitalist. So they have a very productive economy. This is primarily because capitalist countries put a lot of emphasis on capital, which technology, tools, machinery are things that allow you to be more productive over time. The long-term growth is what is big for capitalist countries. Property rights. This one is not thought about a lot, but specifically when it comes to a lot of free countries like America, the ability to own your own business and to own your own land and own your own home has put a strong incentive to improve your productivity over time. Because you're not just given those things, you actually do work for them. Good and bad. It can mean you lose your job, it can mean you go homeless. But it can also mean that if you become more productive, work harder, can make more stuff, you can get a better living. So I think the property rights is possibly like an upward mobility thing. Capital. Again, tools, technology, machinery, that is the big one. Countries with more capital than others are more productive historically. Japan was number 3 on the list. Japan is small. It has terrible natural resources. It is super hard to produce on that country. It is an island nation that is lots of mountains. That is not great for producing stuff. They don't have a lot of like farmable land and usable land. Okay, so what they've done is had a ton of technology, tools, and machinery that allows them to produce. Korea, same thing. India has a lot of people, but not a lot of capital, which is why it has a lower GDP than... The GDP is pretty dang close to, if not lower than, Texas. Human capital. Brain power, knowledge, education, that helps too. And then natural resources are sort of your fail-safe. If you don't have a lot of the other things, you can be really high on the list if you just have a bunch of natural resources. Saudi Arabia is 20th in GDP rankings. They don't have a super beneficial economic system. They don't have a lot of property rights. They don't have a lot of capital and human capital. But they got oil, and a lot of it. So they're pretty high up on GDP. Last bit. This is the last thing for today. This is the last bit of notes for this week. GNP, Gross National Product. So GDP is stuff that is made within your country's borders. It's made domestically. GNP is made by nationals. Nationals being people from your country. So while GDP is stuff made here, GNP is stuff made by people from here. And by people, I mean people and or businesses. So things that are produced domestically by foreigners, so say immigrants that come over here and start working here and still are not like US citizens and stuff, that work will count for our GDP. It would not count towards our GNP. However, if say you, after you graduate college, go to England and work for a bit, your work might be counted as America's GNP, because it is money made by Americans overseas. It is calculated almost the exact same way, C plus I plus G plus XN, but they add in this net foreign factor income component, which basically just does the difference between income earned in foreign countries by residents of our country, subtract the amount made by foreigners here. Now again, this can include our businesses. So like I mentioned, a Ford factory in Mexico doesn't count for our GDP. That can count for our GNP. A Toyota factory in like Plano doesn't count for our GDP, but counts for our GDP, but it also counts for Japan's GNP. So people or businesses, that's an important caveat, can also be businesses by that country. So there's your difference between GNP and GDP. GDP made here, GNP made by people or businesses from here. So GNP does a good job of measuring your global impact. GDP does a good job of measuring how productive your country is, just literally the borders of the country. Boom. That is it for this week's... Oh, I did the thing again. How do I keep grabbing that? I keep grabbing that. I have no idea how I keep grabbing that. There we go. Okay. That is it for this week's videos. That is it for this week's lecture content. Next week in my class, we'll be doing practice over that math. So have those formulas down. The practice questions that were on those slides, work through them if you didn't see me do so. Try them yourself. Make sure that you can do that math. The practice next week will be mostly over just the function of doing the math, not necessarily like you being able to define it, just understanding like, okay, if I was given the numbers on a question, could I figure out how to use it? Yes. That'll be the game plan for next week. But that is it for this week's content. So GDP notes for part 1 and part 2 are what you're responsible for. For those of you that were in my class, that are my students, you guys are also responsible for the test that it's on Wednesday. And again, I'll check the announcements, check the email. I'll have the full instructions for you in the email. And then Monday and Tuesday, we were reviewing for that test. So it was Monday, Tuesday review, Wednesday test, Thursday, Friday notes over GDP. That was the game plan for this week. Cool. Thank you guys for watching. Really do appreciate it. Next week, we'll be covering things like CPI and inflation rate, as well as unemployment, and a little more on the real versus nominal math stuff, because that usually needs a little more reinforcement. All right. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Have a good one.